Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Dean's Conversation Series. We are thrilled to have with us Chief Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer from the Northern District of Illinois. She is the first female Chief Judge, and she has had a long and very exemplary career. And as you know, on these things, I don't give a long bio because usually my first question helps to elicit some of that information. So welcome, Judge. I know you grew up in Minnesota and you spent some time in Japan as a child. So can you share with us some of your background and what led you to the University of Chicago Law School?
Well, first, I actually, I'm not sure, is this on? I'm not sure if it's on. I actually grew up in St. Louis, but my family moved to Chicago, to Minnesota, there it is. My family moved to Minnesota when I was in college, so that became home for me. Was born in Japan when my father and mother served there as Lutheran missionaries in the northern island of Japan, so very cold country. Certainly, Chicago seems balmy even on a day like today. But I went then to, grew up in St. Louis, went to college in Indiana, and became interested in law school kind of late in my college days, more or less because I knew I wanted to stay in school, but I couldn't kind of narrow down into one area of discipline for graduate studies. Maybe many of you feel that way too, and ended up thinking, well, one way of staying in school is law school. And one of the things I liked about law school is that, as opposed to graduate school, which requires you to have some kind of a focus and know what thesis you want to write and the like, in law school they just give you a bunch of courses you got to take. And in other words, it takes kind of the decision-making process away from you. I also loved to argue and applied to a number of law schools and was lucky to get in the University of Chicago and get a very nice financial package there, and it was within a day's drive of my home in Minnesota, so really was very appealing to me to attend law school on the south side here.
After law school, you clerked for Justice Wall.
That's
and on a state Supreme Court. How did that experience influence the trajectory of your career?
I think it didn't seem to at the time, but in retrospect, I think it had a tremendous impact on me. Justice Wall was the first woman to serve on the Minnesota Supreme Court. She had had a career that, at least on paper, didn't seem to prepare her all that well. She worked as a defender, a criminal defense attorney in a law school clinic. That was her entire professional experience. So when she got to the Minnesota Supreme Court, there was a lot of criticism that she, wasn't qualified, wasn't prepared, didn't have any civil experience. Didn't have significant jury trial experience, which actually wasn't true. But there was a lot of criticism, and she took the position, I remember her saying this quite well, I'll just learn on the job the way the men always do. And her confidence in the fact that she could do this is something that she was capable of and would do and would be effective at, was something that I thought was just infectious. She was a wonderful writer, terrific writer, a woman of very, very hard-headed woman, but very filled with compassion. She saw, like many older people do, the angles, the other sides of various issues, and didn't reach a knee-jerk response in any case. Wonderful mentor to me, wonderful encouragement for me, and she was, the fact that she was very proud of me and of her other clerks was something that I always have felt very good about.
I read in some articles that it was that experience that led you to want to become a judge.
Well, in my memory, that's right. But I will tell you that when I was sworn in as a magistrate judge in the United States District Court here, my first federal judge position, I invited, you invite speakers to come and speak on your behalf at the ceremony. And one of my speakers was a law school classmate of mine, a good friend, who said when he was, talking about me, well, we always knew Becky wanted to be a judge. So this was somebody I knew in law school. I guess the idea must have been in my head even back then, although I don't remember it consciously. But in my memory, it was, being with Justice Wall and realizing that the satisfaction of that job would be so tremendous for me. I did keep it in mind, and I know that I had it in my mind at the time that I came to Chicago to practice, because I remember being asked by, potential employers, well, where do you still see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, what are your goals? And I remember telling at least a couple of them, well, I would love to be a judge. And I remember one young woman I was interviewing with said, well, I don't know how important this is, but you kind of look like a judge, which I did not think was a compliment.
So what steps did you take during your career to allow you to be in the right place at the right time to take advantage of judicial opportunities? I know that you started as a judge relatively early in your career.
Relatively young in that I was, I think, quite realistic about what the odds were, and that is that they're long, no matter how well qualified you are, no matter how talented you are, and you know there are many very well qualified, talented women and men who do not have my job, who would be very good at it. So I'm conscious of that all the time. But back then, the idea of being on the federal bench was just unimaginable to me. But I thought, well, you know, there's a state courts, there are a lot more judicial positions there, and I thought that was a possibility. But that was kind of tough too, because then, largely, and to a certain extent still today, there are political aspects to that. You can run for office, and you can actually run on the ballot and become a state court judge. The other thing is you can become an associate judge in the circuit court, and that requires being selected by the full circuit judges, but that too can be a very political process. So I thought my odds there were long as well, because I am not at all a political person, not at all. And then there was a position open as an administrative law judge with a state agency, and the pay was really poor, and the circumstances were very humble. But I just loved the idea of that title, administrative law judge, and the work itself was really satisfying. Lawyers on both sides of the cases typically. It wasn't the typical administrative law situation where you have, you know, a litigant versus the agency. It was really more like an actual trial setting. I had the rules of evidence applied. We would have a court reporter. We would rule on objections, just very much like trials. And I thought that would be a great job to have, and I applied a couple of times and then ultimately did get it. And that was my first judge job. Still remember how happy I was that first day. Walked in, and my very first day on the job, I was writing an order involving admission of testimony from an expert witness, and how happy I felt to be doing that work.
So you went from there to become a U.S. Magistrate judge.
That's right.
Could you talk to the students about what that process looks like? Because that's a unique process to become a judge.
It is. You know, there are, as you're very familiar, there are district judges, judges in the Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court. Those are the three levels of Article III judges in the federal system. But there are other judges. Bankruptcy judges are chosen by the Courts of Appeals. They have, you know, those of you who know nothing about bankruptcy should know that those are terrific jobs. They're wonderful jobs. They're very broad, very interesting jobs. And then the district judges choose magistrate judges, who are also have judicial responsibility, typically pretrial responsibility. They handle a lot of settlement conferences. They also very often supervise discovery. They can also conduct hearings and trials on consent of the parties. If the parties agree, then the magistrate judge can act just as the district judge acts. So that was a huge step for me, that the process involves an application, a very detailed application, and then being interviewed by a merit selection panel that's appointed by the district court. And once you get through that screening, the panel gives the court 5 names for every vacancy. So you go in then and interview with all the judges. I remember my interview for that position. 20 judges around a table and me. And pretty scary, and I didn't know them all very well, because my practice, not really my practice, I was then an administrative law judge in a state agency, so I didn't get to federal court very often at all. The district judges were very unfamiliar to me, and I had to make a point of learning who they were. But then she got chosen for that job and was in the job for about 7 years when it was then Senator Simon, but the process was maintained by his successors to have a merit selection panel for district judges as well. That practice has come and gone over the years. It doesn't always get adhered to, but when I was applying to be a district judge, there was a merit selection panel that was similar to the one that chose me for magistrate judge. So it was kind of a similar process, but the interview process in the end was being interviewed by the senators instead of being by the district judges.
So what is then the process in the Northern District of Illinois, because it differs, of becoming chief judge?
Actually, it's by statute, so it should be the same in other courts, but there are some differences that I can tell you about in a minute. The chief judge of a court with multiple judges, such as ours, is the judge who has the most seniority but has not yet reached the age of 65. Now, exceptions are made in other districts, sometimes out of necessity because they don't have enough judges. So they might have somebody who doesn't really meet those qualifications serve as chief. But in our court, for many years, it's been the judge who's most senior and not yet reached the age of 65. So I became chief before my 65th birthday, obviously, because our then chief, Ruben Castillo, stepped down a few months before his term would otherwise have expired. Had he not done so, I would have aged out, and somebody else would be chief judge now, probably a man. So Judge Castillo made that decision. He himself was the first Hispanic chief judge in our court, and he made that decision very consciously. He said, there's never been a woman chief judge in our court, and there's something I can do about that. I personally can do about that. So it was an act of what I consider to be great generativity on his part, and I'm very grateful to him. And I would like to say that I would hope that other women will be grateful to him too, because once that's happened, it's not a big deal anymore. I mean, I often tell people, years from now, I'm the first woman to be chief, but I won't be the last. And years from now, we're going to look back on the idea of there being the first woman chief judge as sort of quaint. Just as it's going to seem like, well, why not? Of course. And I, at least in my own life, I have Judge Castillo in large part to thank for that.
And you actually took one of my questions, so thank you. That was perfect. First female follows first Latino judge. Why is diversity on the federal bench so important for our society?
I think diversity on the federal bench, on the state bench, and in the law practice generally is really important for all kinds of reasons. I think judges need to have the faces of the community, and that includes black faces, Hispanic faces, the faces of women, the faces of older and younger people, because we all have different perspectives. It's easy for me to say that I'm going to be sensitive to issues that are experienced by people of different color, LGBTQ people, people with experiences different from mine. It's easy for me to say that I'm going to be sensitive, and I think all of us have an obligation to be as sensitive as we can be. But there are perspectives that people of different experiences have that I simply would not have, and I think it's very important to have those faces on the bench to the extent that we can. I think it's important in the law practice too, because lawyers can come to the court and present different issues and different experiences in ways that I might not think about. I think it's really very important. There's not. It's been true for many, many years now that the numbers of women and men in law school classes are about even. In some instances, there are more women and men in law schools these days. And yet we still see it takes a long time for that to bubble up into the settings of the courtroom or the partnership level at firms, especially the executive level at firms. It's got to continue to happen. The same thing is true of minority representation. We see that, we see people of color and people of different backgrounds and orientations in law school, but we don't necessarily see them bubble up through the system, and that really needs to happen.
So tell us, who's in your chambers?
My chambers consist right now of I have a judicial assistant. Back in the day, we would call her a secretary. She does so much more than that. Judicial assistant. I have currently 2 full-time law clerks and 1 law clerk I'm sharing with another judge. That situation evolved because that judge and I both have large multi-district litigation pending before us that generate additional work, so we were able to get the assistance of an additional law clerk. In addition, I have a courtroom deputy. That's the person who sits in court and basically creates short orders based upon what I say and do in court. We used to call those minute orders, just like taking the minutes at a meeting. That's kind of the model. And then I have a court reporter assigned to me. She's not in chambers, but she's in an office very nearby. And those are the people that I see every day, in addition to, of course, my colleagues, to the extent that I get the chance to see those. And I also work very, very carefully with our clerk of court. which is it's a little bit of a misnomer. The clerk of court is really more of I would call him a COO. He's the guy that handles money. He's bonded. He takes in funds when money has to get deposited with, for example, the court registry. He makes a lot of personnel decisions. He supervises our electronic filing process. Large numbers of staff report to him, and he's somebody I talk to several times every day.
So about a week ago, we had Chief Justice Ann Burke here, and the students heard a bit about how a state Supreme Court justice interacts with her law clerks and what they do. What do your law clerks do?
Every set of law clerks is a little different. They bring their personalities to the table, and that makes a difference to me. But in general, they do a lot of writing. They are drafting opinions in cases involving motions to dismiss or motions for summary judgment. That would be most common. Motions in limine, sometimes sometimes post-trial motions. They will sit in on trials, particularly bench trials, because for a bench trial I have to write a decision as opposed to just letting the jury reach a verdict. They also sit in on jury trials with the thought that if there are post-trial motions that need to be ruled on, they'll have that background and be able to do that. I really encourage them to the maximum extent possible to observe what's going on, not only in my courtroom, but other courtrooms in the building. The law clerk experience is you become very close to these people that work with you so carefully over the years. But I want them also to recognize it as the great educational experience that it is. So they will sit in on other trials sometimes. We, as a group, our judges, for example, if somebody's trying a criminal case and the defendant's going to take the stand, which is unusual, most of the times defendants don't. The defendant's going to take the stand, we'll all get an email, defendant taking the stand, and we send our law clerks to go watch that because it's usually pretty exciting to see the cross-examination. We have, our Court of Appeals sits in our building right next door, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. When there's an interesting argument going on, the law clerks will go upstairs and watch that, particularly when there's an en banc. That's always quite a show to see all the judges and hear their questions. Our Court of Appeals, as you're probably aware, they like to call themselves a hot bench, by which they mean they're very well prepared and they'll jump all over people with questions. And it's really kind of exciting to watch an oral argument in the Seventh Circuit.
When you're hiring a new law clerk, what are the things that you're focusing on when you evaluate the applications?
I look for, of course you want somebody that's very smart. They have great grades usually. Good writers. I look at the writing sample carefully. Even the slightest problem with their writing is something that would be a disqualifier for me because they really have to do so much writing. And because writing, I think, is a great measure of how intelligent you are. I look for people who bring something else to the table. I always ask my interviewees, what would you be doing if you weren't in law, if you weren't doing the law? And I like to hear what they have to say. There's no one right answer, obviously. I've had answers that vary from, I'd like to be a journalist, I'd like to be a historian, I'd like to be a musician, to I had somebody who said, well, does talent matter? I said, no, just what would you most like to do? And he said, I'd like to be a tight end for the Chicago Bears. I hired him. I like to hear people that have something else going on in their lives. And I also like people who have an association or determination that connects them to Chicago. And the reason for that is I love to stay in touch with my law clerks even after they're gone from chambers. I like to maintain the relationship that to a certain extent. I mean, they all grow up and get older and they do become important and they go off on their way. But it's nice when, years later, if they call me and say, I'm thinking about making a career change, what do you think about this? And if it's something in the community, I can maybe answer that question for them. The other thing is I have a practice of having my law clerks, past and present, in every 5 or 6 weeks for a book discussion. We have a little book group. And it's always, every time that we get together, it's a different group because it depends on who's busy doing what. But I usually get, 5 to 10 people sitting around a table talking about a book, and it's just wonderful to see them again in that context.
Well, I did understand that you're a voracious reader. I think you've just confirmed that. Are there some good books that you've read lately that you could recommend, or are there one or two for law students that you would put at the top of the list for them to make sure to put on their reading list, maybe for the summer?
Because they're too busy right now, right?
Right.
Okay, well, a book that it's a little dated right now, but it was really terrific and better than the Rules of Civil Procedure is the book of Civil Action. It really explains the whole process of discovery. It was terrific. I think it's really. I believe everyone should read fiction. I meet people who say they never read fiction. I believe every now and then you should read fiction. It gives you kind of an insight in the human experience. And the law is very much a human activity. I often tell jurors, the jurors will come in and I'm giving them their little pep talk, and I tell them, it's not a perfect system because no human system is perfect. But I think the jury system comes, as close as we can to being, good government in action. But reading fiction gives you a feeling about, what another person's experience is like. You get into the hearts and minds and souls of other people. A book I just read that I think is like that a great deal. I read Olive Kitteridge a couple of years ago, and now Elizabeth Strout has written a new one called Olive Again, and it's terrific. And I'm at nearing the end of my career. Olive in this set of, it's really a collection of short stories that kind of forms a novel. But Olive is older, and it's a look at a perspective, a part of life that we don't think about very often, which is what it's like to be in our 70s or 80s. But still, that human heart is beating inside, and we still fall in love, and we still have resentments, and we still have goals and dreams. Getting a perspective like that is very useful. So that book was great. I read a book. I've read a book recently called Every Man Dies Alone, which interesting perspective on what the German resistance to the Nazis was like. And I can say in a word, it was somewhat anemic. Not because the Germans didn't resist, they did, but because the Gestapo was so effective that it really, everybody was talking about each other and ratting you out, and it was very, very difficult to get any traction if you wanted to do something about Hitler. So that was worth reading. And what I'm reading next, we're going to reading Salman Rushdie's book Midnight's Children, which I've never read, and I think it's a classic, and I think probably everybody should read it, and I haven't, so I will.
So back to judging a little bit.
Okay.
What's your favorite thing about being a judge and the least favorite thing about being a judge?
My least favorite thing about being a judge, or the hardest thing about being a judge, is the same one that I think every federal judge would say, and that is sentencing people. It's agonizing. It tears your heart out. There are, I can think on, count on maybe one hand the number of times I've issued a stiff sentence and thought, thank goodness I can put this person away. The vast, vast, vast majority of the time, you see people on their complexity, and you see, if you've got an understanding of human nature, you can see that was a human being who went the wrong way and made a lot of mistakes and did a lot of stupid things, but he's a human being or she's a human being just like me. And it's very hard to be the heavy in that situation. Especially hard when it's somebody who you realize did not have a lot of resources in life and made really ugly and bad choices, but it can kind of be understood in their circumstances. So that's very, very hard. Another thing I would complain about if I'm complaining is I think of judging as too much of a good thing. It's just a lot of work. There are things I love to do in my life, not just reading, but things like sewing and music and seeing the movies and writing letters to friends and traveling to see friends, and a lot of those things I've from time to time just not been able to do because I just have too much work, and that's very, very hard. That's very hard. On the positive side of things, there's really nothing I like better than saying sustained or overruled. It's pretty terrific to be sitting on the bench and just watch the drama of human nature that you see in a trial. It's pretty cool. I don't view a trial as entertainment for me, but it really is very, very interesting to see a trial, and I love that. I also would say that the thing I love most is the opportunity to do, in any setting, always do what I think is right, not what's most expedient for my client, not what will get me most quickly from point A to point B, but what I feel is the right result. And that's an incredible luxury. It's an incredible luxury. You know, I've got a beautiful chambers, I've got wonderful law clerks. There's just nothing more satisfying than working with young people. You professors all can confirm that. It's a great, great joy to work with young people. I've got my own bathroom with a shower, and my wardrobe problems are always solved. I always just wear a black robe. So it's pretty great for any professional woman to have that opportunity. But the best thing of all is just the rule, to always do what you feel is the right thing, what's the best thing for society and for these individuals that are before you.
So let's talk a little bit about attorneys who appear before you. What do the best attorneys do to represent their clients before you? And what should attorneys avoid doing when they're appearing before you?
Well, you hear this all the time from judges, but it is so true. The best lawyers are the ones who are truly prepared. And by preparation, I don't just mean knowing what's about to happen and being prepared to answer that question, but thinking the second or third or fourth question down the road and having an answer for that. We spend a lot of time on the bench in the Northern District of Illinois. You know, by the way, federal judges really vary in terms of their practice. And in some courts, it's unusual to get into the courtroom at all. Most motions are done on paper. The judge rules in writing. You don't see them. In our court, it's different. We have a motion call just about every day. I'm in court every morning. The reason I was a little late getting over here is I was hearing a discovery dispute. And in a discovery dispute, here's an example of good preparation. When one side has asked for the sun, the moon, and the stars, the responding lawyer might want to say, Judge, we're not giving them the universe. What I will say is the moon and a couple of planets, and here's why. Explain, have looked through the issue from the other side's perspective, realized and recognized what that other side genuinely needs, and then presenting that as a proposal. 9 times out of 10, the judge says, well, that sounds reasonable to me. By the same token, also in the discovery arena, you'll see lawyers who come to court and say, Judge, this is extremely burdensome. It's going to take us 700 hours to do this and that. But come to find out, they actually don't know. They just got that information from a client, and when you actually go and do the computer search or whatever it is, it turns out it's far less burdensome. Or the contrary. Somebody says, all they need to do is a word search, Judge, and these things are going to pop right up. And, well, no, it turns out it's much more complicated than that. So good lawyers are really, really prepared. Good lawyers are always respectful. They recognize, even if we think this judge is an idiot, we're going to have to act like she's Einstein because she's the one who's making the call. So they're respectful. They don't interrupt. If they do need to make a point that the judge missed somehow, they do that in an extremely thoughtful way. They're good writers. They communicate clearly with short sentences, very clear paragraphs. I know it's hard to know this, but grammar and spelling really do matter big time. We find that kind of thing, little mistakes like that, very, very annoying. So being a good writer is extremely important. And the reference to brief, be brief. So often when we have people who ask us for leave to submit a memorandum that exceeds our presumptive page limit of 15, very often it turns out those last 7 pages were not necessary at all because it just really it really wasn't well written or well edited. The famous line is that somebody turns in a 30-page brief and the judge says, why didn't you make it 15 pages like our rules require? And the lawyer says, Judge, if we had more time, I would have made it 15 pages. And that's the truth. If you have more time, you can condense what you're writing down to a reasonable amount. You can make those points very, very clearly in fewer pages, 9 times out of 10. That's true for me too. I just was reviewing another thing I was doing this morning before I came over, is revising an opinion and realizing a couple of paragraphs, I don't really need those. You don't need to say everything. Just say what matters.
Could you share some thoughts about why an independent judiciary is so important to our democracy?
Well, I think I've got a quote here, if I managed to throw it in. Maybe I didn't. There are Well, I had a little quotation from Andrew Jackson, so I'm just going to tell you all to go Google Andrew Jackson and get a quote about judiciary. But let me just say that from my perspective, in these times in particular, every one of our institutions is under attack. We're in a world where facts are not facts anymore, and there is just a great deal of distrust and skepticism and cynicism about our institutions. And I think in this context, more than ever, it's so important that we in the judiciary are above the fray. We are going about our business. We make decisions independently. We are not influenced by the news. We are not influenced by political rhetoric. We're not influenced by public opinion in any specific way. We make decisions based on the rule of law and based on what we know to be right, because that's what good government would always do. I think democracy is a fragile thing, and our nation's a fragile thing. And the courts are particularly fragile. We don't have a standing army. We don't have any enforcement mechanism at all, none. All we have is respect. That's all we have. And if we lose that, we cannot function effectively. So that's why everything we do has to be filtered through the lens of, will this bring respect on the federal courts? Is what I'm about to do something that will bring honor and respect, and people will understand that? And even if they disagree with it, they'll adhere to it because they recognize that that's the significance of what we're doing.
What is the most difficult professional dilemma that you have faced and can share, and how did you go about handling it?
I've had many hard decisions, and those, you sometimes the best way to reach a very, very difficult decision is write the whole decision the other way. In other words, write it so the other side can win, and then see if you can live with that. That's just one way to solve very, very difficult problems. I would say professional dilemmas that come up very often involve, especially recently, they involve people want you to come and speak and endorse something and be a presence at some event, or recommend something, and those are all things that are very, very, very difficult for judges to do and probably improper. You'll get asked by some legal organization to come speak, and it sounds like a fine thing to do, and then you realize this organization is all aimed at the insurance defense bar. This is not a neutral group. And you realize now I'm signed up to speak to these people, but I really shouldn't do that. I've had situations like that where when despite my best efforts, I didn't realize, maybe sometimes even until the last minute, that this might not be the right thing to do. It's very awkward to kind of walk away from a situation like that. I've had some difficult personnel decisions to make, particularly as chief judge. Those are dilemmas because you have to do what's best for the court. That's my responsibility is to the court. And yet I know sometimes I have to hurt some individual in order for me to carry out that responsibility in an effective way. So that's very hard. Judges, I think, are insulated in certain ways from some of the most unpleasant aspects of professional life. And here, let me give you, since I'm a little bit off the topic, but the situation for women in the workplace is not always pleasant. And I know that because I have cases involving, factory settings where things that are said to women that are just incredible to me and really insulting and very upsetting. And I had this exalted position, even before I was chief judge, just as judge. People, they're very respectful to me. Within my chambers and out of my chambers, I get treated very, very well. I don't have insulting or nasty comments made to my face. Or made on the elevator on the way down, fine. I don't have to listen to that, that's fine. But I think it's really important for judges to remain sensitive to the fact that they have this really insulated situation, and a lot of people have a lot more difficult challenges to face.
You are married to a professor at Northwestern.
Right.
You have 2 grown and very successful daughters. Over the years, how did you manage to balance so successfully family and work?
I'm gonna begin with where you began, which is, I think it's very, very difficult to do it alone. Those of you who are single parents, God bless you. I think it's very, very difficult. I think the best thing you can do for yourself is find a life partner who loves you and who respects your career just as much or more than he or she respects their own career. And I think that makes a tremendous difference in work-life balance, that there are times when I could not be the one to take the little ones to the pediatrician, even though I wanted to be that one. I mean, I think most women, most mothers feel that way, but you can't always do it, and you have to have somebody who steps up to the plate and says, I can do it today, I'm on base, I'm on board, I'll take this on. You probably have heard, because she's so present in the news now, about RBG and her husband Marty and what he did for her over the years. I guess her first efforts at cooking were kind of a disaster, and Marty, who was also not a cook, said, I'll take over, I'll do this, and did become a very accomplished cook. In fact, at the Supreme Court bookstore, the most popular book that you can buy in the Supreme Court bookstore is the cookbook of recipes created by Supreme Court spouses. And Marty Ginsburg's tomato sauce, I recommend it highly. It's very, very good.
This is going to be my final question, and we'll open it up. So be thinking about what questions you might have for the Chief Judge. Your mother recently passed away, and I read about her that she was a teacher and a missionary and had 6 children. And she was described as a creative teacher, exuberant baker, avid reader, ingenious crossword solver, lifelong learner, and traveler of the world. She sounds like an amazing person. What are some of the key lessons that you learned from your mother?
My mom was really brave. She was really brave. She was a very, very young woman, extremely attached to her father and mother, especially her father, when she met my dad, and it became very clear that he was going to be sent to Japan. And this is, long before cell phones, long before the internet, long before email. So she was going to go away from the people she loved and not have any contact with them for years and years. And she did that, and had 3 children, and she, in fact, when the babies were born, she communicated with her family by telegram. That's the way you communicated back then. And I love this story. I was born on September 13th in Japan, and the telegram, my parents have it, sent to her parents, said, Rebecca Ruth, born September 13, and the date line was September 12th, because the date line, we were in Japan, they were in the United States, so they learned on September 12th that I was born on September 13th. But she was brave in other ways too. She stepped up when we had problems. I had a real problem, I remember, in the 7th grade. It's kind of a long story. She was great. She kind of just told people what was going to happen, and she was not afraid of pushback. She would speak up when it was necessary, and she was kind of fearless about what the consequences might be. We're thinking about her a lot these days. The memorial service was just this last weekend. She was a real force. She was a real force. She's a complicated person, complex person, not a perfect person. None of us are. She had her issues just like all of us do. But I think of her courage as something that's really inspiring.
So what questions do we have from the audience?
Yes.
I'm currently interning at the Federal Defender's Office, and we went over to the SOAR program graduation. Yeah. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, and maybe whether there's any plans to expand it, or just to speak a little bit about that program.
The SOAR program is an acronym for Sentencing Options That Achieve Results, and it's what might have been called back in the day pretrial diversion, when people have been charged, but somebody sees a glimmer of hope for them and puts them in this program, and over several months they have to meet a lot of requirements, get a job, get clean, get sober, straighten things out if there's a restitution issue, and then after several months, assuming complete compliance with the program, they can have their charges dismissed. It's a wonderful program. We would love to expand it. It's not so easy because typically, from my perspective, it's not so easy to expand it because in the federal courts, you don't really get charged very often unless things are pretty bad. I mean, we don't have a lot of misdemeanor charges. That just doesn't happen very much. We don't have any very many mild things that we can put people in that kind of program for. Another program we have in our court that I think is really noteworthy is the reentry court, which is the court kind of set up for people who are on supervised release, which is what happens after you do a period in custody. You're on supervised release for a number of years. And on supervised release, you have to meet a lot of requirements from the probation office. Our reentry court beefs up those requirements, and if you meet the beefed up requirements, then we can sometimes excuse you from 1 or more years of supervised release. So those are other programs we have. We'd love to expand both of these things. They're human resource intensive. So you have to be careful about how many resources you want to pour into this at the expense of, kind of everybody else. But we would like to expand them. Yes.
So you went into law school kind of with a very open mind and kind of broad possibilities without anticipating that someday you would become a judge.
Right.
Is there anything looking back in law school that was helpful or informative to you now as a judge that maybe you would have thought of if you had considered becoming a judge from day one?
Yes. Had I known I would be a district judge, there are several courses I would have taken that I did not take. I took antitrust, and it's really helpful when an antitrust case comes along, but I kind of wish I had taken a patent law class. Now, it turns out I know a lot about patent law now, but it was a hard slog to get there versus, having some background coming in. I took, of course, federal, civil procedure and civil procedure 2, but any advanced civil procedure class of any kind I should have and would take. If there's an advanced evidence class, if there's a federal jurisdiction class, anything like that, any procedure course, I would have done more. I think I did a clinic that was helpful in law school. Might have done more of that if I could have. But one great thing about the law, you're all learning the law, and you're learning to write. And there's one class I never took in law school, and I'm just fine for it. This is probably not what the dean wants me to say. I never took corporations. And I passed the bar. I'm fine. I get it. So it just didn't work out schedule-wise for me, and I just said, okay, whatever. I'll learn on my own. That is the beauty of the law. If you have learned the skills you're supposed to be learning here, you can teach yourself some other area. You might never have heard of letters of credit by the time you graduate. And if you get a case involving letter of credit, you can sit down and learn what that law is. And then the next letter of credit case that comes into your office, you're going to be the expert. That's how the law works. You try some little thing, and it turns out you then become the expert. And that's you can learn any area of the law if your skills if you've been well educated as you all are being. You'll be fine. Yes.
Hi, Judge. I direct our externship program. We have a number of students who are really interested in externing for judges. And I was wondering if you could, give some advice as to what, your chambers looks for with externs, and also when students are externing, ways that they can really get the most out of that experience.
Well, I look for kind of the same characteristics in externs that I would look for in my law clerks. But the externship experience, at least in my chambers, is the longer I'm on the bench, the more it is true that the externs observe what's going on, as opposed to I don't consider them free labor. First of all, it's not proper, and we're not paying them. There's laws against that kind of thing. So we don't want to abuse the externs. But in addition, this is a great opportunity for them to observe what happens in court. So that's what they're generally doing. I insist that they meet with me every week, and they always do, and we talk over what they've observed, what questions they might have. If they have done some writing for me, we can talk about it. I try to give them projects. I do give them some writing projects, and I try to make those, single issue do a memo on this one issue, or if there's some very narrow motion that can be ruled on. And I may or may not use the work that they produce, but it's great experience for them to have that opportunity. And there too, I'm always on the lookout. We've now kind of created a master court calendar of everything that's going on in the courthouse. So I'm always on the lookout. Something interesting is going on. Walk down the hall to Judge Kendall's chambers, you're going to see, or courtroom, you're going to see this or that. Or Judge Kennelly's on trial. Go downstairs to 21. Try to do that. It's good. It's great to work with externs because we, only so many slots as law clerks. We can't work with everybody that wants to be with us. The number of people that apply is it's extraordinary. But we can expand a little bit by having people in for a semester or two to work as externs. We've had good, we've had several people from John Marshall in our court. I know that, there's a pretty good IP program here, and I know that a number of the judges who are in our patent pilot, which is kind of a misnomer, but it's a group of judges that are more likely to get patent cases than others. I'm in that group. We often have John Marshall students as externs and working with on patent cases. Yes?
Hi, I was wondering, I know you said you're insulated in your position now, but I was wondering if prior to your position as a judge, you ever faced any adversity as a woman trying to pursue law in a legal career? And if so, how you kind of overcame that?
Well, here's a story I've told, and let me preface this by saying, I am the last woman in the city of Chicago who should whine, right? Don't be a whiner. You're the chief judge, for heaven's sake. So I'm not whining. I've had a very, very happy career. But there was an episode that I use as kind of an illustration, and here's what happened. When I was a young associate, there was the practice in the firm was that whenever a juicy case came in, it was pretty clear who was going to get it next. They were pretty good about rotating the good cases through the young associates. And this really great case came along, and it was definitely my turn. And I got passed over for a younger male associate. And I decided I got to speak up. I can't just sit here in my office and steam about this. I got to speak up. So I went to speak to the partner involved, and I said, I just need to know why did you get assigned that to this other person and not to me? I thought I was up next. And he said, well, we thought about it, but we knew you didn't want it. This case is going to require a lot of travel, and we knew you probably wouldn't want that because you're married. And you know the punchline. This young man was also married. And they then, because he's married and they didn't want him to be separated from his spouse, they flew his wife out to San Francisco every weekend. And they got to stay in this fancy apartment in San Francisco, and it was just gorgeous. And then when the case was over, on his miles, they went to Europe for a vacation. So yeah, I was really annoyed. So I left the firm later on, and now I don't think there's any cause and effect there. I don't think that's the reason I left. I certainly wouldn't suggest that. But one thing that I use that as an illustration, and I use that as kind of a reminder. One of the reasons that I'm very blessed in my current situation is random assignment. When any case comes into the federal court, it goes on, we call it a wheel, but it's not really a wheel. It's just, kind of a spin of the computer. And any judge can get any case, no matter how much of a heater or challenging or difficult. And the fact that I just had some very, very difficult antitrust case, the next one comes in, I may or may not get it. It might make sense to assign it to me because I know what I'm doing now, but it's all completely random. And the beauty of that is that after a couple of years, we're pretty much all experienced trial judges because everybody's had trials to work on. And I think that, when we're looking in society for ways to make things equal, in any setting, think about being random about who's getting what work. Now, that doesn't always work. It doesn't always make sense. It can be very impractical in some circumstances. But another way to kind of achieve a little bit more diversity is, when in any team project, you don't necessarily have to include somebody of color, but include someone you've never worked with before. And sooner or later, things balance out. If we make a really conscious effort to reach out and not always rely on the usual suspects.
And over here.
Hi, Judge. Thanks for coming. You're the first woman to be Chief Judge of the Northern District. The Central District and the Southern District are also headed by women
Correct.
judges. The Seventh Circuit has a Chief Judge who's a woman. The Illinois Supreme Court has
Chief Judge is a woman,
Chief
right.
Justice. The deans of John Marshall, Paul,
Northwestern.
Kent, Northwestern, Northern, Southern are all women. We have a woman mayor, county board president, state's attorney, the president of the Association of American Law Schools and the American Bar Association are both women. I think this is a good thing.
I do too.
And I'm just wondering if there's anything any specific direction that we can push or help bring this amazing concurrence of events to more people's attention, that these opportunities are available and that they will have an effect in the law.
Notice that many of those positions are, government or quasi-government positions. When I walk out onto the bench, I see who's in the courtroom. Very often, it's a lot of white men, and the women who are in law school have not bubbled up. Except where you see women in the courtroom is very often government jobs. So the prosecutor's office, the defenders, the state's attorney, the Illinois Attorney General, those jobs are, you tend to see women and minorities in those jobs, and then they have the kind of experience that qualifies them for the kind of elevated positions you're talking about. A thing you didn't mention is of the top, the U.S. News and World Report. You can ignore most of that, but the top 16 law schools this year, every one female editor-in-chief. That's pretty remarkable. So, and this year's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. So keep that in mind as well. I would like to see those numbers continue and grow, and particularly in the private sector, in the corporate world, in the world of big law. I'd like to see those numbers include women at the highest levels of the lucrative practice of law that there is out there. I think I'd like to see more flexibility in lots of legal settings, and I think that's one of the reasons that women have been challenged about getting ahead, particularly in law firms, but it shouldn't be. It should be that we have, have more flexible arrangements for everybody, male and female. I think that makes a big difference. I think, many of the women you mentioned are, in fact, mothers and have had, either taken time or needed to take time for childcare responsibilities. And one of the things that makes a difference in the world, and this is something I always push, when I meet a young man who's at a law firm and who's about to become a father, I always tell that person, you take that leave. Take every day of the leave, because otherwise you get the situation we've got now, where it's only women who take time off for childcare. So then we have this association that it's like a female thing to do, and worse, if we promote people based on how many hours they've actually been present in the office, the men have a built-in advantage. So I tell men they owe it to themselves and to their own children and daughters to take that time off. Take it off. If those of you who end up in firms, fine, wonderful. If you get leave for childcare, by all means take it.
Well, with that, we are at time, and we want to again thank you for being with us today. We appreciate it.